I never believed in monsters. Not the kind from storybooks, anyway. I was a soldier, trained to fear men with guns, not shadows in the trees. But that was before 1943. Before the Amazon. Before I learned that some nightmares are older than human memory, and they've been waiting in the green dark since the world was young. My name is Captain Eduardo Santos, and I'm the last man alive who knows the truth about what lives in the heart of that jungle. The others, my entire squad, they're gone now, buried in unmarked graves, or worse, still out there somewhere, rotting in the belly of something that shouldn't exist. It started in January of that year. The war was raging across Europe and the Pacific, but Brazil had its own shadows to chase. Our intelligence division had intercepted strange radio signals coming from deep within the Amazon basin, short bursts of static and German voices, far beyond where any rational expedition would venture. High Command believed the Nazis were establishing a secret base, perhaps a submarine refueling station or a communications outpost. They needed someone to investigate. They chose us. 8 men. The best jungle fighters in the Brazilian army, or so they said. I think they chose us because we were expendable. I remember the briefing in Rio de Janeiro. Colonel Vasconcelos spread a map across his desk, yellowed and cracking at the edges. His finger stabbed at a region marked only with question marks and the words, Terra Incognita, unknown land. You'll insert here, he said, tapping a tributary of the Rio Negro. Follow the water upstream for approximately 200 kilometers. Intelligence suggests the German presence is somewhere in this region. His finger circled an area that looked like nothing but endless green on the map. What kind of force are we expecting? I asked. The colonel's expression darkened. We don't know. The signals stopped 3 weeks ago. Complete silence since then. That should have been our first warning. But we were young, arrogant, convinced of our invincibility. We loaded our gear, rifles, machetes, medical supplies, rations for 3 weeks, and headed into the jungle like heroes from a radio drama. The first week was routine. Hot, humid, mosquitoes thick as fog. We hacked through undergrowth that fought us for every meter, crossed streams where piranhas flashed silver in the murky water, and slept in hammocks strung between trees that groaned in the night wind. Sergeant Costa, our tracker, led us deeper into the green maze, following tributaries that grew narrower and darker as we pushed forward. But something was wrong. Even then, I felt it. The jungle was too quiet. In my previous expeditions, the Amazon had been a symphony of life. Howler monkeys screaming, parrots shrieking, insects buzzing in constant chorus. But here, the deeper we went, the more the sounds faded. By the 10th day, we moved through a cathedral of silence, broken only by our boots sucking in the mud and our machetes chopping through vines. Captain, Private Mendez whispered one evening as we made camp, have you noticed? No birds, no monkeys, nothing. I had noticed. We all had. But I didn't want to acknowledge the fear that was growing in my chest like a cold stone. On the 12th day, we found the first sign that we weren't alone. Costa held up his fist, and we froze. He knelt by the riverbank, examining something in the mud. When I approached, I saw what had stopped him. A footprint. But not human. Not anything I recognized. It was 3-toed, each toe ending in a claw that had sunk deep into the soft earth. The print was as long as my arm. Jaguar, Private Torres suggested, his voice shaking slightly. Costa shook his head slowly. No jaguar makes a print like this. We followed the tracks for an hour before they disappeared into the water. None of us spoke much after that. The jungle seemed to press closer, the canopy above so thick that only fragments of sky showed through, and even the sunlight looked green and diseased. That night I took first watch. The darkness in the jungle is absolute. A blackness so complete it feels solid, like you could reach out and touch it. I sat with my back against a massive tree trunk, rifle across my lap, listening to the breathing of my men and trying not to imagine what might be watching us from beyond the firelight. Around midnight I heard it, a sound that made every hair on my body stand straight. It started as a low rumble, so deep I felt it in my chest before I heard it with my ears. Then it rose, becoming a roar that seemed to shake the trees themselves. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. Not a jaguar's growl, not a caiman's bellow. It was something ancient, primal, a sound from a world before men walked the earth. The roar faded, leaving only silence and the hammering of my heart. I didn't wake the others. What would I have told them? That I'd heard a nightmare? That something impossible was out there in the dark? But I didn't sleep again that night. And when dawn finally came, pale and sickly through the canopy, I saw that Costa was awake too, staring into the jungle with eyes that held the same terrible knowledge I felt growing inside me. We were being hunted. The 13th day brought us to the ruins. We'd been following the river through a narrow gorge, the water rushing white over black stones, when the jungle suddenly opened up. Before us stood something that shouldn't exist, a clearing carved from the forest, and in its center, massive stone structures covered in vines and moss. "Madre de Dios," Corporal Silva whispered, making the sign of the cross. The ruins were unlike anything in the archaeological records. Not Incan, not Aztec, not any indigenous culture I'd ever read about. The stones were carved with strange symbols and images, geometric patterns that hurt to look at, and figures that seemed half human, half reptile. But what caught my attention were the newer additions. Wooden scaffolding, metal equipment rusting in the humidity, and remnants of a camp. German equipment. We moved in cautiously, weapons ready. The camp had been abandoned, but not long ago. Weeks, maybe a month. Tents still stood, though they were rotting in the moisture. Papers scattered across tables had turned to pulp. And everywhere, there were signs of hasty departure. Equipment left behind, supplies abandoned, personal effects dropped and forgotten. "They left in a hurry," Costa observed, kicking at a canteen lying in the mud. Private Mendez found the first body near the edge of the clearing, or what was left of one. The German soldier's uniform was shredded, the body inside torn apart with such violence that we could barely recognize it as human. The bones had been crushed, splintered like kindling. "Jesus Christ," Torres muttered, turning away. We found 3 more bodies as we searched the camp. All showed the same massive trauma. Broken, crushed, torn apart by something with incredible strength. But there were no bullet wounds, no signs they'd fought back. Whatever had killed them had been too fast, too powerful. In the largest tent, I found the radio equipment, German military grade, sophisticated for the time. It had been smashed, deliberately destroyed. But more importantly, I found the research. The Germans hadn't been here to establish a base. They'd been conducting an expedition, a scientific one. Papers and journals were scattered across a desk that had somehow survived the chaos. Most were ruined by moisture and time, but I managed to salvage a leather-bound journal, its pages still partially readable. The writing was in German, but I'd learned enough during my training to make out the general meaning. The entries were clinical at first, documenting an expedition that had arrived 6 months earlier. They'd been searching for something, following old legends, indigenous stories about a lost world deep in the Amazon where time had stopped, where creatures from the ancient past still lived. I'd heard these stories myself, dismissed them as folklore, the kind of tales every jungle produces. But these Germans had found something. The journal's tone changed dramatically about halfway through. The scientific observations gave way to fear, paranoia. The researcher, a Dr. Muller, wrote about sounds in the night, about massive shapes moving through the jungle, about footprints that shouldn't exist. And then, in one of the final entries, words that made my blood run cold. "We were wrong. They are not extinct. They are not animals. They are intelligent and they remember. God help us, they remember." The last entry was barely legible, written in a shaking hand. "They're in the compound, breaking through the perimeter. The creatures, they're so much larger than we thought. Nothing stops them. The rifles do nothing. We are all going to die here. If anyone finds this, stay away. For the love of God, stay away from." The entry ended there, the pen trailing off into an ink smear. "Captain," Silva's voice came from outside the tent. "You need to see this." I stepped out into the clearing, and Silva led me to the far side of the ruins, where the jungle began again. He pointed at a tree, a massive kapok, its trunk wider than 3 men standing side by side. The bark had been gouged by claws. Deep furrows, each as wide as my hand, running from 8 feet up down to the ground. Whatever had made those marks had been tall enough to reach that high while standing on the ground. "Captain," Costa said quietly from behind me, "we should leave. Now." For once, I agreed with him completely. But as we gathered the squad to move out, Private Torres called out from the edge of the clearing. "Sir, there's something here. Another structure." Against my better judgment, I followed him. Beyond the main ruins, hidden by overgrowth, was another building, this one more recent, clearly constructed by the Germans. A concrete bunker, half buried and camouflaged with vegetation. The metal door hung open, twisted off its hinges from the inside. The interior was dark, but we had flashlights. I descended the concrete steps with Torres and Mendez behind me, our lights cutting through the darkness. The bunker was a laboratory. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with scientific equipment, microscopes, beakers, specimen jars. But everything had been destroyed, smashed in what looked like a frenzy of violence. Glass crunched under our boots. Papers were scattered everywhere. Then Mendez's light found the far wall, and we all stopped breathing. It was covered in photographs, dozens of them, pinned and taped, many torn or water-damaged, but enough remained to tell a horrifying story. They showed the Germans' expedition over months, setting up camp, exploring the ruins, venturing into the jungle. But mixed in with the standard documentary photos were others. Blurry images of massive shapes moving between trees, close-ups of footprints in mud, three-toed and clawed, and then one image that was clear enough to see in detail. It showed something standing at the edge of the jungle, partially obscured by foliage. It stood on 2 legs, easily 15 feet tall, with a massive body covered in scales that reflected the camera's flash. The head was reptilian, angular and powerful, with eyes that caught the light and reflected it back like twin coins. The photograph's caption, written in German below it, read simply, "Tyrannosaurus, alive." I stared at that photograph for a long time, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. Tyrannosaurus. That was impossible. A fever dream. The creature in the photo had to be something else. A trick of light, a hoax, anything but what the caption claimed. But deep down, in a place beyond reason, I knew it was real. I'd heard its roar 2 nights ago. I'd seen the footprints. I'd found the broken bodies of men who'd encountered something with the strength to crush bone like paper. "Captain," Mendez whispered, his voice tight with fear, "we need to get out of this jungle. Now." Couldn't argue. But as we turned to leave the bunker, Torres's flashlight swept across something we'd missed in our initial shock. A map on the wall, marked with German annotations. It showed the surrounding area, with various locations circled and labeled. One location, about 5 kilometers northwest of the ruins, was marked with multiple red circles and the word "nest" written in capital letters. Nest. The implications made my skin crawl. If these creatures had a nest, that meant there were more of them. Perhaps many more. And we were somewhere in their territory. We climbed out of that bunker like men escaping a grave, grateful for the sunlight even though it was weak and filtered through the endless canopy. I gathered the squad in the center of the clearing. "We're leaving," I announced. "Back the way we came, as fast as we can move." No one argued. But Costa, studying the tree line, said something that stopped us all. "Captain, we're surrounded." At first, I didn't understand. Then I looked where he was pointing and felt my stomach drop. All around the clearing, at the edge of the jungle, broken branches hung at about 8 feet high, recent breaks still showing white wood beneath the bark. They formed a rough circle around the entire clearing, as if something tall had walked the perimeter, pushing through the undergrowth. "How long have those been there?" Silva asked. "They weren't there when we arrived," Costa said. "I would have noticed. That meant something had circled us while we were exploring the ruins and the bunker. Something tall enough to break branches 8 feet up. Something that had watched us without making a sound." We moved out immediately, heading back toward the river gorge we'd come through. But the jungle that had seemed merely oppressive before now felt actively malicious. Every shadow could hide something massive. Every sound, or lack of sound, took on sinister meaning. We'd gone maybe a kilometer when we found the path blocked. A tree, a giant ceiba, easily 200 feet tall, lay across our route, freshly fallen. Its trunk was as thick as a house, and its canopy blocked the way forward completely. But what made us stop wasn't just the obstacle. It was the way the tree had fallen. The trunk wasn't broken by wind or lightning. It had been pushed over. The root ball had been torn from the earth, and in the wet soil around it were footprints. The same three-toed prints we'd seen before, but these were even larger, each one the size of a small car. It pushed the tree down, Torres said, his voice cracking, to block our path. Intelligent. The journal had said they were intelligent. We had no choice but to detour, moving parallel to the fallen giant until we could find a way around. This took us deeper into territory we hadn't scouted, where the jungle grew so thick we had to hack through it with machetes, the sound of our blades against vegetation seeming to echo far too loudly in the silence. That's when Private Ferreira, who'd been bringing up the rear, screamed. We spun around, weapons raised, but Ferreira was gone. Just gone. One moment he'd been there, the last man in our line, and the next there was only trampled undergrowth and his rifle lying in the mud. "Ferreira!" I shouted. "Ferreira! Report!" Silence. And then, from somewhere in the thick jungle behind us, a scream. Short, sharp, and abruptly cut off. We stared at each other. 8 men suddenly turned to 7, and none of us had seen what took him. No sound of approach, no warning. Something had snatched a grown man from our formation without any of us seeing it happen. "Form up," I ordered, trying to keep the panic from my voice. "Back to back, weapons out." We stood in a tight circle, facing outward, rifles and pistols pointed into the green walls that surrounded us. My heart hammered against my ribs. Sweat ran down my face, stinging my eyes. Nothing moved. The jungle was still, holding its breath. Then, from above, something wet and heavy landed in the center of our circle. It was Ferreira's canteen, dented and covered in blood. We all looked up at the same time. The canopy above us was so thick we could barely see through it, but I caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the upper branches. Something far too large to be up there, something that moved with terrible purpose. Branches swayed and broke. Leaves rained down. "Run!" I shouted. We broke formation and ran, crashing through the undergrowth, abandoning all pretense of stealth or tactics. Behind us, something huge dropped from the trees with an impact that shook the ground. I heard it pursuing us, heard the thunderous footfalls, each one making the earth tremble. Private Mendez, running beside me, glanced back and his face went white. "Dios mío," he gasped, and put on a burst of speed I didn't think was humanly possible. I didn't look back. Couldn't. If I saw what was chasing us, I knew my legs would stop working, my mind would break, and I would simply lie down and wait to die. We ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, tearing through the jungle without any sense of direction. Eventually, we burst through a wall of ferns and stumbled onto a beach, a narrow strip of black sand beside a wide, slow-moving river. The 7 of us collapsed on the sand, gasping for air, checking to make sure we were all still there. Ferreira was gone. Lost. Dead. Taken by something we hadn't even clearly seen. What was that?" Torres panted. No one answered. What could we say? That we'd been chased by a creature that shouldn't exist, by something from a world 65 million years dead? But we were still alive, and that meant we had to keep moving. The river offered us a temporary respite. Whatever had chased us hadn't followed onto the open beach. Whether it feared the water or simply lost interest, I didn't know, and I wasn't about to investigate. We sat in the black sand, weapons ready, watching the tree line with exhausted vigilance. Sergeant Costa was studying the river, his experienced eyes reading the water. After a few minutes, he spoke. "This isn't the same river we followed in. The current's wrong and it's too wide. That thing chased us off course. Of course it had. Herded us, more likely. The fallen tree, the circle around the camp, the attack from above. None of it felt random anymore. We were being manipulated, driven like cattle toward some purpose we couldn't fathom. Can we follow it downstream?" I asked. Find our way back to the main tributary? Costa shook his head slowly. Maybe, but it'll take days, maybe a week. And we're running low on supplies. We lost 2 packs when we ran, including most of the medical supplies and ammunition. Private Silva, who'd been quietly inventorying what we had left, confirmed it. We have maybe 4 days of rations if we stretch them. Ammunition for perhaps 1 sustained firefight. After that, he trailed off, but we all knew what came after that. After that, we'd be defenseless in a jungle full of monsters. We could build a raft, Corporal Ramos suggested. Float downstream. Let the current do the work. It wasn't a terrible idea, but the thought of being trapped on a raft in the middle of the river, exposed and vulnerable, made my skin crawl. Still, it might be our best option. Before I could respond, Torres, who'd been watching the upstream section of the river, suddenly stiffened. Captain, something's coming. We all turned, raising our weapons. Through the afternoon haze, I could see something floating toward us. A dark shape on the water, moving with the current. As it drew closer, I made out details. Wood, metal, a structure of some kind. It was a boat, or what was left of one. The wreck drifted past us, close enough to the shore that we could see it clearly. It was German, a riverboat probably used to transport supplies for their expedition. But it had been destroyed. The hull was torn open, great ragged holes punched through the metal as if by massive claws. The cabin was smashed flat, and twisted around the deck railing were human remains. Bones, shredded uniforms, equipment scattered and broken. They tried to escape by water, Mendez said quietly. It didn't work. The wreck drifted past us and disappeared around a bend in the river, leaving us with a horrible knowledge. Even the water wasn't safe. Whatever lived in this jungle could pursue prey into the river just as easily as through the trees. Building a raft suddenly seemed like a very bad idea. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, I made a decision. We camp here tonight, on the beach in the open. We'll keep the fire large and maintain a constant watch. In the morning, we move parallel to the river but stay in the cover of the tree line. We keep moving until we reach familiar territory. No one looked happy about it, but no one had a better plan. We built the fire from driftwood, making it large and hot, the flames leaping high into the darkening sky. The heat was almost unbearable in the humid air, but we wanted light and we wanted it to be visible from a distance. Fire has kept predators at bay since the dawn of humanity. I prayed it would work on these predators too. As night fell, the jungle came alive with sound for the first time in days. But these weren't the normal sounds of the Amazon. They were calls and cries I'd never heard before. Deep bellows that made the air vibrate, high-pitched shrieks that cut through the darkness, and other sounds I couldn't even classify. It was as if we'd somehow crossed into another world, a place where evolution had taken a different path. Around midnight during my watch I saw them. Eyes in the darkness beyond the firelight. Multiple pairs, reflecting the flames with that same coin-bright gleam I'd seen in the photograph. They watched us from the tree line, patient and unblinking. I counted at least 5 pairs at different heights, some low to the ground, others higher up than any man could stand. "We have company," I said quietly, waking the others. They saw the eyes too. We sat in a tight circle around the fire, backs together, facing outward. For hours the eyes watched us. Sometimes they moved, repositioning themselves, circling our camp. But they never came closer. The fire kept them at bay just barely. "Why don't they attack?" Silva whispered. "We're outnumbered. They could rush us." "They're studying us," Costa said. "Learning. They're smart enough to know that fire is dangerous, but they're trying to understand it. Understand us." The thought of those creatures learning, analyzing, planning, it was somehow more terrifying than simple animal aggression. We weren't dealing with beasts. We were dealing with something that could think, that could reason, that could hunt with intelligence as well as instinct. Dawn came with agonizing slowness, the sky lightening so gradually I almost didn't notice the change. But as the sun finally rose, the eyes disappeared, withdrawing into the jungle. We were exhausted, running on nothing but adrenaline and fear, but we couldn't stay here. We broke camp quickly, gathered our meager supplies, and started moving downstream, staying just inside the tree line where we had cover but could still keep the river in sight. The morning passed without incident, though we could feel them out there. A presence in the jungle, watching, tracking, pacing us. The silence was absolute again, that unnatural quiet that meant every other creature had fled this region. Around midday we found the plane. It had crashed into the jungle canopy years ago, maybe decades, and then fallen through to the forest floor where it lay broken and rotting. The fuselage was largely intact, though vegetation had grown through it, reclaiming the metal for the jungle. German markings were still visible on the tail section. Another expedition? Ramos wondered. I climbed into the wreckage, curious. Inside, I found skeletal remains in pilot uniforms, still strapped into their seats. The instruments were corroded beyond recognition, but I found something else. A locked metal case, secured to the floor beneath the co-pilot's seat. Took me 20 minutes to pry it open with my knife. Inside were documents, protected from the moisture by the sealed case. More journals, more research notes, and most importantly, a detailed map. This expedition had been earlier than the one we'd found at the ruins. The dates in the journal indicated 1938, 5 years before. They'd been the first to discover this place, the first to document these impossible creatures. And they'd gone further, explored more deeply, mapped the terrain we were now trying to escape. The map showed something that made my heart sink. We were far off course, much farther than I'd feared. The region we were in was marked with handwritten German notes. I could make out some of the words: Gefahrliches Gebiet, dangerous territory; Kein Rückkehr, no return. And in the center of the mapped area, a large section circled and labeled Das Nest, the nest. We were heading directly toward it. I climbed out of the wrecked plane and spread the map on the crumpled fuselage for the others to see. Their faces fell as they realized what I'd already understood. We'd been going the wrong direction. The river we'd been following didn't lead out of this nightmare. It led deeper into it. "We have to turn around," Torres said, his voice edged with panic. "Go back the way we came. Back toward whatever chased us?" Mendez countered. "Back toward the ruins where those Germans died? There's nothing back there but death." "There's nothing ahead but death either," Torres shot back. "Enough," I said quietly, but with enough authority to silence them both. "We can't go back. They're behind us, pushing us forward. We know that. Our only option is to keep moving but change direction. Head east, away from the river, away from this nest location." Costa studied the map, tracing routes with his finger. "The terrain gets worse to the east. Swamps, steep ravines. It'll slow us down significantly." "Everything slows us down," I replied. "But at least we'll be moving away from the concentration of these things." We gathered our gear and prepared to move out when Silva, who'd been standing watch, suddenly grabbed my arm. "Captain, the jungle." I looked where he was pointing and felt my blood run cold. The vegetation around us was moving. Not swaying in the wind. There was no wind. Moving deliberately, branches being pushed aside, ferns being trampled. And it was happening all around us in every direction. The undergrowth shook and rustled as something large, no, multiple large somethings, approached from all sides. "Weapons ready?" I ordered, my voice steady despite the terror building in my chest. "Circle formation. Don't fire unless I give the order." We formed up, 6 men in a tight circle, rifles raised. The movement in the jungle continued, growing closer. I could hear breathing now, deep, rumbling breaths that sounded like wind through a cavern. And underneath that, a new sound, a low, rhythmic clicking, like the ticking of a massive clock. Communication. They were communicating with each other. The first one emerged from the undergrowth 30 meters to our right. It stood on 2 powerful legs, each thick as a tree trunk, with massive taloned feet that sank into the soft earth. The body was enormous, covered in scales that ranged from dark green to nearly black, with patterns that seemed to shift in the dappled light. The arms were small, comically small compared to the massive body, but they ended in wicked curved claws. And the head, God, the head. It was like something from a nightmare sculpted by a mad god. Angular and powerful, with a jaw full of teeth the size of railroad spikes. The eyes were forward-facing, intelligent, and they looked directly at us with an expression I can only describe as calculating. This wasn't a mindless predator. This was a thinking being sizing up its prey. Tyrannosaurus, Costa breathed. It's actually a Tyrannosaurus. The creature was easily 20 feet tall, maybe more. It watched us without moving, its head tilting slightly as it studied us. Then it made that clicking sound again, a rapid series of clicks and low rumbles that echoed through the jungle. And 3 more emerged from different directions. We were surrounded by 4 of them. For creatures that had ruled this planet millions of years ago, that should have been nothing but fossils and museum displays. 4 impossible monsters that were very much alive and very clearly coordinating their movements. "Hold your fire," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Nobody moves. We stood frozen as the creatures circled us slowly. They moved with surprising grace for their size, each footfall deliberate and quiet. They were taking our measure, testing us, trying to determine if we were prey, threat, or something else entirely. The largest one, the first to emerge, took a step closer. Then another. It lowered its head, that massive skull coming down to our level, and it sniffed. I could feel the force of its breath, hot and reeking of old meat. It smelled us, learning our scent. Then it pulled back and made a different sound, a low rumble that I felt in my bones. The other 3 responded in kind, and then, as if following some unspoken command, they withdrew. One by one, they backed into the jungle and disappeared, leaving us standing in shocked silence. "Why?" Mendez started, then had to clear his throat. "Why didn't they attack?" Costa was shaking, his rifle trembling in his hands. "They weren't hunting us. They were evaluating us, deciding if we're worth the effort. Or they're saving us for later," Ramos added darkly. Silva was staring at the spot where the largest tyrannosaur had stood. "Did you see its eyes? Really see them? There was intelligence there. Real intelligence. That's not an animal. That's something else." He was right, and that terrified me more than anything else. An animal you could predict, understand to some degree. But intelligence? Intelligence meant planning, meant strategy, meant they could outthink us as well as overpower us. We didn't discuss it further. We just ran. We abandoned stealth entirely and crashed through the jungle, heading east as I'd planned, away from the river and the nest. The terrain did get worse, just as Costa had warned. We struggled through swamps where the water came up to our chests, where things moved beneath the surface that we didn't dare examine too closely. We climbed over fallen logs the size of buildings and descended into ravines so steep we had to help each other down. And all the while we heard them. Never saw them, but heard them, the footfalls, the breathing, the clicking communication. They were following us, pacing us, hurting us, always hurting us. By late afternoon, we were exhausted. Torres collapsed beside a stream, gasping for air. I can't go any further," he panted. "I'm done." "We rest for 10 minutes, I said. "Then we keep moving." But as we caught our breath, I noticed something that made my stomach knot. The ground around the stream was disturbed, massively disturbed. Trees were knocked down, vegetation was trampled in wide swaths, and everywhere, footprints. Not just the 3-toed prints of tyrannosaurs, but others. Smaller prints, but there were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all concentrated in this area. "Captain," Costa said from upstream, "you need to see this." I followed him along the bank until we reached a place where the ground rose into a low hill. And there, on the hillside, I saw what had made all those prints. Eggs. Dozens of them, each the size of a barrel, half buried in mounds of rotting vegetation. Some were intact, others had already hatched, the shells broken open from the inside. And moving around the nesting ground were smaller creatures, juveniles, each about 6 feet long, with the same basic body plan as their massive parents but covered in downy feathers rather than scales. Baby tyrannosaurs. We'd stumbled into a nesting ground. I faced danger before. I'm a soldier. I've stared down armed men, navigated minefields, survived ambushes. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the raw, primal terror of standing in a tyrannosaur nesting ground. watching those juvenile monsters snap at insects and tear apart small animals they'd caught. "Back away," I whispered to Costa. "Slowly. Don't make a sound." We retreated step by careful step, but the jungle had other plans. Behind us, a branch snapped, loud as a gunshot in the heavy silence. We froze. One of the juveniles raised its head, alert. Then another. Within seconds, all of them were staring in our direction, their eyes reflecting that same eerie intelligence I'd seen in the adults. One of them opened its mouth and made a high-pitched shrieking sound, calling for Mama. "Run!" I shouted. We didn't make it 10 meters before the ground shook with the thunderous arrival of the adults. They burst from the jungle on all sides, not for this time, but at least 8 or 9, all converging on the nesting ground in response to their offspring's distress call. The largest one, the same one that had sniffed us earlier, spotted us immediately. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I saw something in that gaze that chilled me to my core. Recognition. It remembered us, and it was done being patient. It roared, and the sound was so loud, so powerful, that I felt it in my chest cavity like a physical blow. Then it charged. We scattered in different directions, the only tactic that made sense when facing multiple predators. I ran with Costa and Mendez, crashing through undergrowth that tore at our uniforms and skin. Behind us, the Tyrannosaur pursued, each footfall like a bomb detonating, shaking the earth. I risked a glance backward and saw something that defied physics. That creature, weighing several tons at least, was moving through the dense jungle with impossible speed, smashing through obstacles that would have stopped a tank. It was gaining on us. "Split up," I yelled. "They can't follow all of us." Mendez veered left. Costa went right. I kept straight, hoping to draw the creature's attention. It worked, but not in the way I'd hoped. The Tyrannosaur followed me, its massive head lowering as it focused on my fleeing form. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I leaped over logs, ducked under hanging vines, splashed through a stream without slowing. And still it came, tireless and terrible, a living nightmare that had survived 65 million years just to chase me through this godforsaken jungle. Then the ground disappeared beneath my feet. I'd run straight off the edge of a ravine. I fell, tumbling through space, branches whipping past me, and hit the slope about 30 feet down. I rolled, crashed through undergrowth, and finally slammed into a fallen log at the bottom, the impact driving the air from my lungs. I lay there, stunned, trying to remember how to breathe. Above me, I heard the Tyrannosaur roar in frustration. Couldn't follow me down the steep ravine. It was too large, too heavy. I'd accidentally found a place it couldn't reach. For several minutes, I heard it up there, pacing along the edge, making clicking sounds that might have been rage or frustration. Eventually, the sounds faded as it moved away, hopefully to rejoin the others at the nesting ground. I took stock of my injuries. Nothing broken miraculously, but I was covered in cuts and bruises. My rifle was gone, lost somewhere during the fall. I had my sidearm, a pistol with maybe 15 rounds, and my knife. That was it. I was alone at the bottom of a ravine, in a jungle full of dinosaurs, with almost no weapons and no idea where the rest of my squad was or if they were even still alive. The sun was setting, shadows filling the ravine with premature darkness. I couldn't stay at the bottom. It would be a death trap in the dark. I began climbing, using roots and rocks as handholds, making my way up the opposite slope from where I'd fallen. It took me almost an hour to reach the top. By the time I pulled myself over the edge, full night had fallen, and the jungle was alive with sounds, roars and calls and movements that surrounded me in the darkness. But I also heard something else, something that gave me hope. Voices. Human voices, calling out in Portuguese. "Here!" I shouted back. "I'm here!" 3 shadows emerged from the darkness. Costa, Silva, and Ramos. They rushed to me, helping me to my feet, and I could have wept with relief at seeing them alive. "The others?" I asked. Costa's face was grim. "Torres is dead. Killed in the first charge. Mendez is with us, but he's badly injured, broken leg, maybe worse. We've carried him as far as we can. We found Mendez sitting against a tree, his face pale and slick with sweat. His right leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and even in the darkness I could see it was bad. Very bad. "Captain," he whispered when he saw me. "Leave me. I'm done." "We don't leave people behind," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I knew how hollow they sounded. How were we supposed to carry an injured man through this nightmare jungle? But we tried. God help us, we tried. We fashioned a crude stretcher from branches and vines and took turns carrying Mendez. But it slowed us down drastically, and we could only move in the darkness by moonlight, which meant going slowly, carefully, making noise with every step. The creatures found us around midnight. We heard them first, multiple sets of footfalls, circling us in the darkness. Then the eyes appeared, dozens of pairs, surrounding us completely. We set Mendez down and formed a defensive circle around him, pistols drawn, though we all knew how useless they would be. The Tyrannosaurs, at least 5 of them, emerged from the darkness into the moonlight. They didn't charge. They just watched us, their massive heads tilting as they studied our defensive formation. Learning. Always learning. Then the largest one took a step forward. Another. It approached slowly, cautiously, as if testing to see what we would do. Ramos fired his pistol. The shot was deafening in the quiet jungle, and the bullet struck the Tyrannosaur in the chest. The creature barely reacted. It glanced down at the tiny wound as if mildly surprised, then fixed Ramos with a stare that promised death. "Hold your fire," I commanded. "Shooting just makes them angry." But the damage was done. The spell was broken. The Tyrannosaur roared, and the others responded. They began to circle us, moving faster now, coordinating their movements. "They're going to rush us," Costa said, his voice steady despite the terror we all felt. "When they do, we make them pay for every meter." "Understood." We all nodded. There was no escape. This was our last stand. But then something unexpected happened. A new sound cut through the night. A roar from somewhere distant, but powerful enough to make the ground vibrate. It was different from the Tyrannosaur's calls, deeper and more resonant. The Tyrannosaurs around us stopped circling. They turned toward the source of the sound, their bodies tense. Then, one by one, they withdrew into the jungle, disappearing as silently as they'd arrived. We stood there, confused and relieved, trying to understand what had just happened. "What was that?" Silva asked. "What made them leave?" Costa was staring into the darkness where the roar had come from. "Something bigger," he said quietly. "Something the Tyrannosaurs are afraid of." The thought of something that could frighten those monsters was almost more terrifying than the Tyrannosaurs themselves. But it had saved us. For now. We didn't sleep that night. None of us could. We sat in a tight circle around Mendez, weapons drawn, listening to the jungle's nocturnal symphony of impossible creatures. Every sound made us flinch. Every shadow held potential death. Mendez drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and rapid. Without proper medical care, he wasn't going to make it. We all knew it, including him. Around 3 in the morning, during one of his lucid moments, he grabbed my arm. "Captain," he whispered, his voice hoarse, "don't let me slow you down. When the time comes, leave me. That's an order from a dying man." "You're not dying, Private," I lied. "We're all getting out of here." He smiled weakly, knowing the truth but appreciating the lie. "Tell my family I died doing my duty. Don't tell them about the monsters. They wouldn't believe it anyway." Dawn came slowly, the darkness reluctantly giving way to a sickly gray light that filtered through the canopy. In the daylight, Mendez looked even worse. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his injured leg was swollen to twice its normal size. We couldn't carry him anymore. We all knew it. The choice was clear and horrible. Stay with him and die, or leave him and maybe survive. I was trying to find the words to make that impossible decision when Mendez made it for us. "Go," he said. "That's an order, Captain. I'm an NCO. I outrank you in matters of practical sense." He tried to smile. "Besides, I'm tired. So tired. I'll rest here a while." We left him with a pistol, water, and what little morphine we had left in our medical kit. I've made a lot of hard choices in my life, but walking away from Private Luis Mendez, leaving him to die alone in that nightmare jungle, is the one that still haunts me most. We heard the single gunshot about an hour later, echoing through the jungle. Mendez had chosen his own end rather than waiting for the creatures to find him. I prayed it had been quick and painless. Now we were four: Captain Eduardo Santos, Sergeant Costa, Private Silva, and Corporal Ramos. For men trying to escape a prehistoric hell. We moved through that day in a fog of exhaustion and fear. The jungle seemed to go on forever, unchanging and hostile. We had run out of rations the previous day and were now surviving on whatever we could find. Palm hearts, certain types of grubs, water from streams that we prayed wouldn't kill us. By mid-afternoon, we found a small clearing where a massive tree had fallen, creating a gap in the canopy that let in actual sunlight. We stopped there to rest, our first real rest in days. Silva climbed the fallen tree to get a better vantage point, hoping to spot some landmark that might orient us. He was up there for several minutes before he called down. "Captain, I can see something. Smoke." There's smoke rising from the jungle, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers northeast. Smoke meant fire, and fire meant people. Possibly indigenous tribes, possibly survivors from one of the German expeditions, possibly even a rescue party sent to find us. It was the first real hope we'd had in days. "Can you see anything else?" I called up. "There's..." Silva paused. "There's something else. A structure of some kind. Big. Stone." "Captain, it looks like a temple or a pyramid. Massive. How is that possible? There shouldn't be anything like that this deep in the Amazon." Another impossible thing in a jungle full of impossibilities. But if there was a structure, there might be shelter. Defensible position. Maybe even supplies if it was connected to the German expeditions. We headed toward the smoke and the mysterious structure, moving as quickly as our exhausted bodies would allow. The terrain was rough, but we were motivated by the possibility of rescue, of finally escaping this nightmare. As we drew closer, the jungle changed. The trees grew larger, more ancient, their trunks so massive that it would take 20 men holding hands to encircle one. The undergrowth thinned out, replaced by a thick carpet of ferns that came up to our waists. And there were more ruins. Not the weathered stones we'd seen before, but intact structures, walls and buildings covered in vines but still standing after what must have been thousands of years. "What is this place?" Ramos whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Older than the Inca," Costa said, running his hand along a stone wall carved with those same unsettling symbols we'd seen before. "Older than any civilization in the Americas. This shouldn't exist." But it did exist, just like the creatures that hunted us existed. We were in a pocket of the world where the normal rules didn't apply, where the ancient past had survived into the present. The smoke was coming from the center of the ruined city, and as we approached, we began to smell something that made our mouths water despite our fear. Cooking meat. Real food. We emerged into a large plaza, surrounded by intact stone buildings, and dominated by a massive step pyramid that rose perhaps 200 feet into the air. And in the center of the plaza there was a camp, a German camp, but not abandoned like the others. This one was occupied. A man stood by the fire, tending to a pot that hung over the flames. He was dressed in the tattered remains of a German uniform, his hair and beard long and wild, his skin darkened by years of tropical sun. When he saw us, he froze, his eyes going wide with shock. "Mention," he breathed. "La Benda mention. Living people." We approached cautiously, weapons drawn, unsure if he was friend or threat. He raised his hands slowly, showing he was unarmed. "English?" I asked. "Sprechen Sie English?" "Ja." He nodded. "Yes, I speak English. Please lower your weapons. I mean you no harm. I was Dr. Hans Meller, chief researcher for the 1943 expedition." Muller. The name from the journal. But that expedition had been wiped out. How had this man survived? He seemed to read the question in our eyes. "I was the only one, the only survivor. I've been here for..." He paused, seeming to count. Main got, has it been 9 months? I've lost track of time. Your whole expedition was killed, I said. It wasn't a question. His face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he might cry. Yes, all of them. 23 men. Scholars, soldiers, scientists. All dead within 2 weeks of finding this place. The creatures, they attacked our camp. We tried to fight, but bullets barely slowed them down. I survived only because I was collecting samples in the jungle when it happened. By the time I returned, there was nothing left but bodies and blood. Why did you stay? Costa asked. Why not try to escape? Muller laughed. A bitter, hollow sound. Escape? There is no escape from this place. Don't you understand? They won't let us leave. This is their territory, their kingdom, and they guard it jealously. I've tried 3 times to leave. Each time they herded me back, drove me back toward the ruins. They want us here. Why? Silva asked. Why would they want us here? Muller's eyes took on a haunted look. Come, let me show you something. Then you'll understand. He led us to the base of the step pyramid and pointed to carvings that ran along the bottom tier. They depicted scenes that were both fascinating and horrifying. Humans and dinosaurs living together, but not in harmony. The humans were clearly subservient, shown bringing offerings to massive reptilian figures, shown being hunted, shown being sacrificed. This city wasn't built by humans, Muller explained. It was built for them, by them. He pointed to the dinosaurs in the carvings. They had intelligence even back then, thousands of years ago. They had a civilization of sorts, and humans were their prey, their servants, their livestock. The implications were staggering. These weren't just animals that had somehow survived extinction. They were an intelligent species that had ruled this part of the world for millennia, that saw humans as we see cattle. The Nazis knew, Muller continued. That's why they sent expeditions here. They'd found ancient texts, artifacts, that hinted at this place. They wanted to study them, maybe even weaponize them. Imagine unleashing trained tyrannosaurs on your enemies. He laughed again, that same bitter sound. Such arrogance. Such foolishness. You can't tame them. You can't control them. You can only survive them if you're lucky. We sat in Muller's camp as evening fell, eating the stew he'd prepared. Some kind of lizard, he explained, avoiding our eyes when he said it. The food was tough and gamey, but after days of near starvation, it tasted like a feast. As we ate, Muller told us his story. After the massacre of his expedition, he'd survived by hiding in the ruins, learning the creatures' patterns. The pyramid he'd discovered was a safe zone of sorts. The tyrannosaurs and other creatures rarely came close to it, as if the ancient structure still held some significance for them, some taboo. They're more than animals, Muller said, poking at the fire with a stick. Much more. They have language, complex communication. They have social structures, hierarchies. They plan, they remember, they pass down knowledge to their young. I've watched them for months now, and I'm convinced they're as intelligent as we are, just in different ways. If they're so intelligent, Ramos asked, why haven't they left this region? Why stay hidden in the jungle? Muller considered this. I've thought about that often. My theory? They're the last of their kind. This jungle is their refuge, the final sanctuary of a species that once ruled the world. They've learned to hide, to avoid human contact, to protect their territory. And they're very, very good at it. The German command will send another expedition, I said. Or our own government will. We need to report this, to warn them. Muller's laugh was sharp and humorless. Report what, Captain? That dinosaurs are alive in the Amazon? That an ancient reptilian civilization still exists? Who would believe us? They'll say we went mad in the jungle, that we suffered from fever dreams and hallucinations. And even if someone does believe us, he leaned forward, his eyes intense. Even if they believe us, what then? They'll send soldiers, scientists, hunters. They'll try to capture or kill these creatures. And they will fail. The tyrannosaurs will fight back. And when they do, when they realize humans are a threat to their existence, they won't stay in the jungle anymore. They'll expand. They'll hunt. They'll reclaim territory they once ruled. We'll have triggered a war we cannot win. The thought was chilling. What if Muller was right? What if the creature's intelligence meant they could adapt, organize, wage war on a scale we couldn't imagine? So what do we do? Silva asked quietly. Just leave them alone? Pretend we never saw this? If we want to survive, yes, Muller said. We take our knowledge to our graves. We tell no one. We let them remain a myth, a legend, something whispered about but never confirmed. I couldn't accept that. People had died. My men, his men, crews of the German planes we'd found. Their families deserved to know the truth. The world deserved to know that we weren't alone on this planet, that we shared it with something older and possibly more powerful than ourselves. But before I could argue further, Costa stood suddenly, his head cocked to the side. Listen. We all fell silent. At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the normal sounds of the jungle at night. But then I caught what Costa had heard. A rhythmic clicking, growing louder. Communication. And it was coming from multiple directions, surrounding the plaza. Muller's face went pale. They've never come this close to the pyramid before. Never. Something's changed. How many? I asked, drawing my pistol, though I knew how useless it would be. Too many, Costa said grimly, pointing to the darkness beyond the firelight where dozens of eyes had appeared, reflecting the flames with that now familiar eerie glow. They emerged from the shadows slowly, deliberately, not just Tyrannosaurs but other species too. Smaller ones with long claws and teeth, built for speed. Massive ones with thick armor plating and horns. Creatures I couldn't identify, nightmares made flesh. There were at least 20 of them, maybe more, forming a perfect circle around the plaza. This is it, Ramos said, his voice surprisingly calm. This is where we die. But the creatures didn't attack. They just watched us, their ancient eyes reflecting the firelight, their massive bodies still as statues. The silence stretched out, seconds becoming minutes, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. Then one of them moved. The largest tyrannosaur, the same one that had tracked us through the jungle, I was certain, stepped forward into the light. It approached slowly until it stood only 30 feet from us, close enough that I could see every detail of its scaled hide, every tooth in its massive jaws. It looked directly at me, not at the group, but at me specifically. And in that moment, I understood something that terrified me more than anything else in this nightmare. It recognized me. It remembered me from every encounter we'd had. It had been following me specifically, tracking me, learning about me. The creature lowered its head until its massive eyes were level with mine. We stared at each other across the fire, predator and prey, two species separated by millions of years of evolution. And I swear, I saw understanding in those eyes. Intelligence, intent. It was studying me, learning from me the same way I was learning from it. Then it did something that defied everything I thought I knew. It spoke. Not in words, its vocal structure couldn't produce human language. But in sounds, rhythmic and deliberate, mixed with body movements and gestures. It was communication, sophisticated and intentional. It was trying to tell me something. Muller gasped beside me. Mein Gott is trying to communicate. After 9 months here, they've never tried this before. What's it saying? Silva whispered. I don't know, Muller said, his voice filled with wonder and terror. But it's not random. There's structure, grammar. It's actual language. The tyrannosaur continued its series of sounds and movements for several minutes, then stopped. It waited, watching me, clearly expecting some kind of response. I didn't know what to do. How do you respond to a dinosaur trying to communicate with you? But I had to try something. I raised my hand slowly, palm out, and spoke clearly. We mean you no harm. We're just trying to leave. To go home. The tyrannosaur's eyes followed my gesture, focusing on my raised hand. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It raised its own arm, that small, seemingly useless appendage, and mimicked my gesture as best it could with its two-clawed hand. It was mirroring me, showing it understood the concept of gesture-based communication. Dear God, Muller breathed. It's learning. Right now, in real time, it's learning how we communicate. The tyrannosaur made another series of sounds, different from the first, then turned and walked back toward the circle of creatures. They parted to let it through, then followed it as it led them away from the plaza, back into the jungle. Within minutes, they had all disappeared, and we were alone again in the fire-lit darkness. None of us spoke for a long time. What could we say? We just witnessed something impossible, something that changed everything we thought we knew about these creatures. Finally, Costa found his voice. It wasn't threatening us. It was what? Negotiating? Warning us? I think, Muller said slowly, it was making first contact. Real, intentional first contact between our species. And I think it chose you, Captain, because you're the leader. It recognized that and chose to communicate with you specifically. The implications were staggering. If these creatures had language, had social structures complex enough to identify leaders and attempt diplomatic communication, then they weren't just animals. They were people. Different from us, alien in their thought processes, but still people. What do we do now? Silva asked. I looked at the pyramid looming above us, at the ruins that spoke of an ancient civilization we were only beginning to understand, and at the jungle where creatures older than humanity itself watched us from the shadows. We survive, I said finally. We learn what we can, and then we figure out how to get home and what the hell we're going to tell the world. But even as I spoke those words, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. Nothing in this jungle ever was. We spent that night in shifts, keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. None of us managed more than an hour or two of restless, dream-haunted unconsciousness. Every sound made us jolt awake, expecting another visit from the creatures. But the night passed without incident. When dawn came, filtering through the ruins with that familiar sickly green light, we gathered to plan our next move. I've mapped some of the territory over the past months, Muller said, spreading out papers covered in hand-drawn maps. There's a pattern to their movements. They have hunting grounds, nesting areas, and what I call neutral zones, places they don't frequent. If we time it right, we can move through the neutral zones and make it to the edge of their territory. How far is the edge? I asked. Muller traced his finger along the map. Perhaps 70 kilometers northwest. Maybe 4 or 5 days of hard travel through difficult terrain. And once we reach the edge? Costa asked. Then we're in normal jungle, Muller replied. Still dangerous, but not prehistoric. From there, another 2 weeks to reach the nearest river settlements. It was a long shot, but it was something. Plan. Hope, however fragile. There's something else, Muller said, his voice dropping. Something I haven't told you yet. Something I discovered about 2 months ago. He led us away from the camp, through the ruins, until we reached a smaller pyramid on the far side of the plaza. Unlike the others, this one had an entrance, a dark opening that descended into the earth. I found this by accident while exploring, Muller explained, lighting a torch. What's inside? You need to see it to believe it. We followed him down stone steps that had been worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. The air grew cooler, damper, and smelled of earth and age. The walls were covered in carvings, thousands of them, depicting the history of this place in intricate detail. The corridor opened into a large chamber, and Muller held his torch high to illuminate what lay within. Eggs, dozens of them, each the size of a man, arranged in careful rows. But these weren't in nests of vegetation like the ones we'd seen in the jungle. These were in stone cradles, carefully positioned and protected. A hatchery, Muller said, but not a natural one. Artificial. Built and maintained. Maintained? Silva asked. By who? By them, Muller replied. The Tyrannosaurs. I've watched them come here at night, bringing food for the hatchlings, adjusting the temperatures by opening and closing vents in the stone. They've domesticated fire. I've seen them carrying burning branches to warm certain areas. This isn't instinct, gentlemen. This is architecture, engineering, civilization. I moved closer to one of the eggs and saw that it was marked with symbols, the same symbols we'd seen on the ruins. They have written language too, I said, more statement than question. Yes, Muller confirmed. A sophisticated one. I've been trying to decode it, but it's unlike anything human. Their way of thinking, of conceptualizing the world, is fundamentally different from ours. Ramos had moved to the far wall, where a massive carving dominated the stone. "Captain, look at this." The carving showed a timeline of sorts, a history. It depicted the creatures in ancient times, ruling vast territories, building cities, commanding other species. Then came a cataclysm. The images showed fire falling from the sky, darkness covering the world. The great extinction event that killed most of the dinosaurs. But the timeline didn't end there. It showed survivors, a small population taking refuge in jungles and underground places. It showed them diminishing over millions of years, their territories shrinking, until finally, they remained only in this one isolated pocket of the Amazon. "They know what happened to them," Muller said quietly. "They remember the asteroid, the extinction, everything, and they know they're the last. That's why they guard this place so fiercely. It's not just territory to them. It's their final refuge, the last place in the world where they exist." The weight of that knowledge settled over us. These weren't monsters invading our world. We were invaders in theirs. The last survivors of a species that had ruled this planet for 165 million years, now reduced to a secret population in one of the most remote places on Earth. "Does that change anything?" Costa asked. "We still need to escape. We still need to survive." "It changes everything," I said. "If we make it out, if we report this, we're not just revealing a scientific discovery. We're exposing the last survivors of an ancient race to a world that will either try to exploit them or destroy them." "So Muller was right," Silva said. "We should stay silent." But before anyone could respond, we heard sounds from above. Heavy footfalls, multiple creatures entering the chamber overhead. We'd been so focused on the hatchery that we hadn't maintained proper watch. "Trap!" Costa hissed. "This is a trap." We rushed back up the corridor, but halfway up, we found our way blocked. A tyrannosaur, a juvenile perhaps 10 feet tall but still formidable, stood at the top of the stairs, blocking the exit. Behind us, from deeper in the underground complex, we heard more movement. "There's another way," Muller said, his voice tight with fear. "Through the lower tunnels. Follow me." We ran deeper into the pyramid, our single torch creating wild shadows on the ancient walls. The tunnels branched and split, becoming a labyrinth that Muller navigated from memory. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit echoed through the stone passages. "Where does this lead?" I gasped as we ran. "To the river," Muller called back. "There's an underground waterway that connects to the surface." The tunnel began to slope downward, becoming wet and slippery. We could hear water now, the rush of a current somewhere ahead. The air grew thick with moisture. We burst out of the tunnel onto a stone platform beside an underground river, the water black and fast-flowing. The chamber was enormous, the ceiling lost in darkness above us. And along the walls, in alcoves carved from the stone, we saw something that made us all stop in our tracks. Mummies. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, carefully preserved and arranged. But they weren't human mummies. They were dinosaur mummies, tyrannosaurs and other species. Their bodies dried and preserved, decorated with jewelry and artifacts. "A tomb," Muller whispered. "This is their burial chamber, their sacred place. And we just invaded it." The pursuing creatures emerged from the tunnel behind us, but they didn't attack. They stopped at the edge of the platform, their eyes fixed on us with expressions that might have been anger, or sadness, or something we couldn't comprehend. We'd violated their most holy place, disturbed their ancestors. If there had been any chance of peaceful coexistence, we'd just destroyed it. The creatures surrounded us on the platform, cutting off retreat. The underground river rushed past, our only possible escape route, but we had no idea where it led or if we would survive its rapids in the darkness. The tyrannosaurs didn't move closer. They simply stood there, watching us, their posture radiating something I can only describe as grief mixed with rage. We'd desecrated their sacred place, disturbed their honored dead, committed the ultimate violation in their culture. "We didn't know," I said aloud, knowing they probably couldn't understand but needing to say it anyway. We meant no disrespect. We're just trying to go home. One of the Tyrannosaurs, not the large one we'd encountered before, but a different individual with distinctive scars along its snout, stepped forward. It made a series of sounds, low and rumbling, then gestured with its small arms toward the river. "I think," Muller said slowly, "I think it's telling us to leave, through the river." "That could be a death sentence," Ramos protested. "We don't know where that water goes. Could be a waterfall, could dump us into rapids that'll smash us against rocks." "Staying is definitely a death sentence," Costa countered. "At least the river gives us a chance." The scarred tyrannosaur made the gesture again, more forcefully. The message was clear: leave now, leave through the river, or face the consequences of desecration. "We jump," I decided. "All of us on my count. Stay together if you can." We moved to the edge of the platform. The water below was black as oil, moving fast, and we had no idea how deep it was. We could be jumping to our deaths. But as I looked at the circle of creatures watching us with those ancient, intelligent eyes, I knew we had no choice. 1, I counted. 2, 3. We jumped together, hitting the water like a series of bombs. The cold was shocking, stealing the breath from my lungs. The current grabbed me immediately, pulling me under, spinning me in the darkness. I fought to the surface, gasped for air, and was pulled under again. For what felt like an eternity, I was at the mercy of the underground river, tumbling through absolute darkness, scraping against unseen rocks, fighting just to keep my head above water long enough to breathe. I lost track of time, of direction, of everything except the need to survive. Then suddenly, light. Gray light ahead, growing brighter. The tunnel was ending. We burst out of the mountainside in a waterfall, dropping 20 feet into a pool below. I hit the water hard, plunged deep, and kicked my way back to the surface. Around me, the others were surfacing too: Muller, Costa, Silva. I counted heads. "Ramos!" I shouted. "Where's Ramos?" We scanned the pool, searching frantically. Then we saw him surface near the far edge, coughing and sputtering but alive. All 5 of us had made it. We dragged ourselves onto the bank, exhausted and battered but alive. The pool was at the bottom of a gorge, surrounded by normal jungle. No ruins, no signs of the creatures. We'd made it out of their territory. "Is everyone intact?" I asked, checking myself for injuries. Multiple bruises, some cuts, but nothing serious. The others reported similar damage. We'd been incredibly lucky. "Which way now?" Silva asked, looking around the gorge. Muller oriented himself using the sun, which was actually visible through a gap in the canopy. "Northwest," he said. "We follow the river downstream. It should eventually connect to larger waterways, and those will lead us to settlements." We rested for an hour, regaining our strength, then started moving. The jungle here was different from the prehistoric zone we'd escaped. It felt normal, if any jungle can be called normal. We heard monkeys, birds, the usual symphony of Amazonian life. It was almost peaceful after the oppressive silence of the creature's territory. For 2 days we walked. We fished in the streams, found edible plants, made steady progress. On the 3rd day we encountered indigenous people, a small group of hunters from a tribe that lived along the Rio Negro. They were understandably suspicious of 5 wild-looking men emerging from the deep jungle, but Muller spoke some of their language, and we eventually convinced them we needed help. They led us to their village, where the chief listened to our story with an impassive face. Or rather, he listened to the edited version we told, that we'd been part of a military expedition that was attacked by wild animals deep in the jungle, and we were the only survivors. We didn't mention the creatures, didn't mention the ruins, the impossible things we'd seen. Muller had been right about one thing: who would believe us? The tribe helped us contact the Brazilian military. 2 weeks later, a boat arrived to pick us up. As we sailed away from that cursed region, I stood at the stern, watching the jungle recede. Somewhere in there, in the green depths, an ancient civilization still existed, still survived, still guarded their final sanctuary. But our ordeal wasn't over. Not really. Back in Rio de Janeiro, We were debriefed by military intelligence. We stuck to our story: wild animal attacks, no survivors besides us. They asked about the German presence, and we told them we'd found evidence of expeditions but no active Nazi operations. They didn't believe us. Not entirely. But they couldn't prove we were lying, and without evidence they had to accept our report. Then the visits started. First, it was more military officials, asking the same questions in different ways, trying to catch us in inconsistencies. Then came scientists, anthropologists, archaeologists, all curious about our experience. We told them nothing useful. Finally came the men in dark suits who didn't identify themselves or their agency. They sat us down individually and made it very clear that certain subjects were classified, certain discoveries were matters of national security, and certain truths were best kept silent. They didn't have to say it explicitly. The message was clear: keep quiet about what we saw or face consequences. Muller disappeared shortly after those interviews. Just vanished. I tried to find him, but it was as if he'd never existed. His records were sealed, his whereabouts unknown. I suspect he was taken somewhere for further questioning, or perhaps silenced permanently. Costa, Silva, and I stayed in contact for a few years after we were discharged from the military. We never spoke about what we'd seen, not even to each other. But I could see it in their eyes, the same haunted knowledge I carried, the weight of an impossible truth. Silva died in 1958, a car accident that investigators called suspicious but couldn't prove was anything but bad luck. Costa drank himself to death by 1962, the nightmares and memories finally too much to bear. That left only me, the last survivor of our expedition, carrying the truth alone. I'm an old man now. It's been decades since 1943, since I stood in that ancient plaza and locked eyes with a creature that should have been extinct for millions of years. My hands shake when I write. My memory isn't what it was. But some memories never fade. For 30 years after we escaped that jungle, I lived with the secret buried deep, speaking of it to no one. I married, had children, built a life that looked normal from the outside. But the nightmares never stopped. Every night, I dreamed of ancient eyes watching me from the darkness, of massive shapes moving through impossible ruins, of a civilization that existed in the shadows of the modern world. I convinced myself that time and distance had made the memories less real, that perhaps we had suffered some kind of collective hallucination brought on by fever and exhaustion and fear. Perhaps there was a rational explanation for everything we'd seen. Then, in 1973, 30 years after our expedition, I received a package. There was no return address, no note. Inside was a recent newspaper clipping from a German publication and a photograph. The newspaper article reported the disappearance of a geological survey team in the Amazon basin. 6 people vanished without a trace in a remote region. The Brazilian authorities had searched but found nothing except some scattered equipment. The photograph was grainy, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed the edge of a clearing, and in that clearing stood something that made my blood run cold even after 3 decades. Tyrannosaur, clear as day, unmistakable. Still there, still alive. There was a handwritten note attached to the photo. They're still there, still protecting their secrets. Don't let anyone else make our mistake. H.M. Hans Muller. He was alive, and he was still watching, still monitoring that cursed region, still trying to protect those ancient creatures from discovery. I burned the photograph and the clipping. I don't know why I did it. Perhaps to protect the creatures, perhaps to protect myself from being drawn back into that nightmare. But the message was clear. The secret wasn't just mine to keep anymore. It was a responsibility, a burden we shared across decades and distance. Over the following years, I noticed a pattern. Every few years, an expedition would go missing in that region of the Amazon. Search parties would find nothing, or sometimes just fragments. Scattered equipment, torn clothing, no bodies. The official explanations varied. Attacked by wild animals, lost in the jungle, drowned in the river. But I knew the truth. The creatures were still there, still defending their territory, still eliminating threats to their existence. And they were getting better at it, learning from each encounter with humans, adapting their strategies. I started collecting news articles, reports, any information about that region. I built a file, kept it hidden in my home. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew what to look for. That area was a death zone, a place where people vanished. But it was such a remote region, so difficult to access, that most people dismissed it as just another dangerous part of the Amazon. In 1989, I received another package. This time it contained a journal, Muller's journal, continued after our escape. He'd gone back. The mad fool had actually gone back to that jungle, back to study the creatures. His entries were detailed, scientific, and increasingly desperate. He'd spent years observing them from a distance, documenting their behavior, their language, their culture. He'd witnessed births and deaths, wars between different groups, the slow decline of their population as their already limited genetic diversity took its toll. The creatures were dying out. Not quickly, they were long-lived, some individuals surviving for over a century. But they weren't breeding fast enough to maintain their population. Within a few generations, perhaps within 100 years, they would be extinct. The final extinction of a species that had once ruled the entire planet. Muller's last entry was dated just days before I received the journal. I am old now and ill. The jungle is claiming me as I always knew it would. I'm leaving this journal to Santos because he deserves to know the truth I've learned. The creatures are not our enemies. They are survivors, clinging to existence in the only place left that will hide them. They deserve to live out their remaining time in peace, without interference from our kind. If you receive this, Santos, let them die with dignity. Don't let the world find them. Don't let scientists and trophy hunters and gawkers destroy their final years. Let them fade into legend, into myth. It's the only gift we can give them. The journal ended there. I later learned through back channels that Muller's body was found by indigenous people in the jungle, dead from what appeared to be natural causes. He was buried according to local customs, and his death was never officially recorded. I honored his request. I kept the journal hidden, told no one about its contents. But as I grew older, I began to wrestle with the question. Was I doing the right thing? Shouldn't the world know that one of the greatest species to ever exist was still alive, still clinging to existence? Shouldn't we document them, study them, try to help them survive? What right did I have to keep that knowledge secret? But then I remembered their eyes, their intelligence, the way they communicated and built and remembered. They had chosen isolation over contact with humanity. They had retreated to the deepest, most inaccessible part of the Amazon and defended it for millions of years specifically to avoid us. Who was I to violate that choice? In the early 2000s, I read about new satellite mapping technology, about improved GPS and remote sensing that was making even the most isolated parts of the Amazon accessible to researchers. The ruins, the creature's territory. It was only a matter of time before someone stumbled upon it by accident. I made a decision then. I had to go back. One last time before I was too old, before I died and took the secret with me. I had to see if they were still there, and if they were, I had to warn them. Warn them that their secret was in danger, that the world was shrinking, that their hiding place might not protect them much longer. Took me 2 years to plan and prepare. I was in my 80s by then, too old for jungle expeditions. But I was driven by something stronger than reason, guilt, responsibility, or perhaps just the need for closure. I hired guides, claiming I wanted to visit remote indigenous tribes for personal reasons. We traveled by boat up the Rio Negro, then smaller tributaries, following the same route we'd taken 60 years earlier. The jungle had changed in some ways. Logging had reached areas that had been pristine before, and there were more settlements along the rivers. But as we approached the region of the creature's territory, the changes stopped. That area was still wild, still untouched, still avoided by the local people who spoke of evil spirits and ancient curses. My guides refused to go further. No amount of money could persuade them to enter what they called the death territory. I didn't blame them. I paid them well and sent them back, then continued alone. An old man stumbling through the jungle with supplies, maps, and memories from another lifetime. I don't know if I expected to survive. Part of me hoped I wouldn't. After 60 years of carrying this secret, of being the last living witness to something impossible, I was tired. So very tired. But I had to see, had to know. The jungle was different from what I remembered. Older, wilder, as if it had grown more primal in the decades since our escape. The trees were larger, the undergrowth thicker, and that same oppressive silence we'd encountered before hung over everything. Took me 3 days to reach the ruins. 3 days of struggling through terrain that would have been challenging for a young man, let alone someone my age. But stubbornness, or perhaps obsession, kept me moving. When I finally emerged into the plaza, I stopped and stared. The ruins were still there, still standing after countless centuries. But they looked different, less overgrown, as if someone had been maintaining them. The stone surfaces were cleaner, the carvings more visible. And there were new additions. Fresh carvings, recent work, additions to the ancient stories depicted on the walls. The creatures had continued their art, their history, recording the years that had passed since our last visit. I approached the central pyramid slowly, my heart pounding. I was unarmed, what would be the point? And alone. If they wanted to kill me, I couldn't stop them. "I've come back," I called out in Portuguese, then repeated it in Spanish and the few words of indigenous languages I'd learned. "I mean no harm. I needed to see." For a long moment, nothing happened. The jungle remained silent, the plaza empty except for me. Then I heard it, that familiar clicking sound, the communication I remembered from 6 decades ago. It came from multiple directions, surrounding me. They'd known I was here, probably tracked me for days as I made my stumbling way through their territory. The Tyrannosaurs emerged from the jungle slowly, and my breath caught in my throat. There were fewer of them than I remembered. Only 5 adults that I could see, and they looked different. Older, scarred, their scales duller than I remembered. But their eyes, those eyes still held that same terrible intelligence, that same ancient awareness. And one of them was familiar, the largest one with a distinctive pattern of scars along its jaw. The same individual that had tried to communicate with me in 1943, that had spared our lives when it could have killed us. It was still alive, still here after 60 years. The creature approached me slowly, its massive head lowering to my level. We stared at each other across the decades, predator and prey, 2 old survivors of an encounter that should never have happened. Then it did something that made tears spring to my eyes. It made that same gesture it had made 60 years ago, raising its small arm in a mirror of the human greeting I'd shown it. It remembered. After all this time, it remembered me. I raised my own hand, returning the gesture. "I remember too," I whispered. For the next 3 days, I lived among them. I know how that sounds. An old man camping in the ruins while dinosaurs went about their lives around him. But that's exactly what happened. They didn't threaten me, didn't attack. They simply accepted my presence, as if recognizing that I was no danger to them. I watched them. I took no photographs. I brought no camera, no recording equipment. This wasn't about documentation. It was about witnessing, about honoring them in their twilight years. What I saw broke my heart. They were dying out, just as Muller's journal had predicted. I saw only one juvenile, a young one perhaps 20 years old, still learning the hunting techniques and social behaviors from the adults. No eggs, no hatchlings, no sign of breeding. They moved slowly, conserving energy. Their hunt, when I witnessed one, was efficient but laborious, as if the effort of bringing down prey was becoming more difficult with age. They spent much of their time at the ruins, particularly around the pyramid, as if drawing comfort from the ancient stones and the history they represented. On my 3rd night there, the old tyrannosaur, my tyrannosaur, I'd come to think of it, approached my fire. It settled down nearby, its massive body sinking to the ground with a heavy sigh. We sat together in companionable silence, 2 old warriors at the end of our journeys. I spoke to it then, not knowing if it understood my words but needing to say them anyway. I told it about the world beyond the jungle, about how humanity had grown and spread, about technology and cities and the relentless march of progress. I told it that their time of hiding was coming to an end, that soon, maybe years, maybe decades, someone would find this place and their secret would be revealed. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "Sorry for what my kind will do when they find you." Sorry that you have to live your final years in hiding, afraid of discovery. You deserved better. Your species deserved better." The creature watched me as I spoke, its eyes reflecting the firelight. Then it made a sound, soft, almost gentle, nothing like the terrifying roars I remembered from 1943. It was a sound of acknowledgement, perhaps even acceptance. It knew. They all knew that the end was coming one way or another. On the fourth morning, I prepared to leave. I was out of supplies, and my old body couldn't take much more of the jungle. But before I left, I did one thing. I carved my own addition to the ruins, a small marking on one of the stones, hidden where it wouldn't be easily noticed. It was simple. The year 2003, and a symbol I created to represent peace, farewell, and respect. My final communication with them, a message carved in stone to last long after I was gone. As I made my way back through the jungle, I knew I would never return. This had been my goodbye, my final visit to a world that existed outside of time, outside of history, a pocket of the ancient past still breathing in the modern age. I made it back to civilization, though the journey nearly killed me. I collapsed in a river town and spent 2 weeks recovering from exhaustion, dehydration, and a dozen other ailments. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive at my age after such an expedition. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like a man who'd witnessed the dying days of gods and could do nothing to help them. I'm 93 years old now. 70 years have passed since that day in 1943 when I first saw something impossible in the Amazon jungle. 20 years have passed since my final visit to their territory. I don't have much time left, and I've decided that this story needs to be told, even if no one believes it. So I'm writing it down. All of it. Every detail I can remember. I'm sealing this account in a document that will be released after my death, along with Muller's journal and what few artifacts I kept from our expedition. Let the scientists debate its authenticity. Let the skeptics call it the fantasy of a senile old man. I don't care anymore. The truth deserves to be known, even if it's dismissed as fiction. But there's one more thing I need to tell you, one final piece to this impossible story. Last month, I received a final package. I don't know who sent it. There was no return address, no note. Inside was a single photograph, taken recently based on the digital quality. It showed the ruins, the plaza, the pyramids, all exactly as I remembered them. But empty. Completely empty. No creatures visible anywhere in the frame. At first, I thought it meant they were gone, finally extinct, the last of their kind having died since my visit 20 years ago. But then I looked closer at the photograph and saw something that changed everything. The carvings on the pyramid had been altered. New sections had been added, recent work based on the freshness of the stone. And these new carvings showed something I'd never seen in any of the other historical records. They showed the creatures leaving, migrating, moving deeper into the jungle, further into unexplored territory, to places that even modern satellite mapping hasn't fully penetrated. The final panel showed a symbol that Muller had identified in his journal as their sign for hidden or protected. They'd learned the lesson that 65 million years should have taught them. When your environment becomes too dangerous, you adapt. You move. You hide. The creatures weren't extinct. They'd simply moved somewhere even more remote, even more hidden, taking their civilization and their secrets with them to a new sanctuary that humanity hasn't found yet, and maybe never will. That photograph is the last evidence I have that they're still out there somewhere, still surviving, still protecting themselves and their history from our discovery. Part of me hopes no one ever finds them. Part of me hopes they survive for another million years, hidden in the deep places of the world, the last remnants of a civilization that once ruled the planet. But another part of me, the part that locked eyes with that ancient creature and saw recognition, intelligence, understanding, that part hopes that someday, when humanity is wiser, when we've learned to respect life in all its forms, we might have a chance to truly communicate with them, to learn from them, to acknowledge them not as monsters or animals, but as what they truly are, people. Different from us, alien in their thoughts and ways, but still people, still deserving of respect and the right to exist. I won't live to see that day. None of us from that 1943 expedition will. But maybe our children's children or their children might have that opportunity. might do better than we did, might find a way to coexist with these impossible survivors instead of destroying them. That's my hope, anyway. The hope of an old soldier who saw something he was never meant to see, who kept a secret for 70 years, who watched his companions die carrying that knowledge, and who now, at the end of his life, wants nothing more than for humanity to be worthy of the trust those ancient creatures showed by letting us walk away alive. We were in their territory. We violated their sacred places. We discovered their secrets. By all rights, they should have killed us all, wiped out every trace of our knowledge. But they didn't. They let us leave. They let us live. That mercy, that intelligence, that capacity for restraint, that's what convinced me they weren't just animals. Animals don't show mercy to threats. People do. So this is my testimony, my confession, my warning, and my hope. The creatures exist. They're real. They've survived for millions of years through adaptation, intelligence, and the will to endure. They're out there somewhere in the green depths of the Amazon, still protecting their final sanctuary, still living according to ways older than human civilization. Leave them alone. Let them have their remaining time in peace. Don't go searching for them with cameras and rifles and scientific curiosity. Don't try to capture them, study them, exploit them. They've earned the right to exist undisturbed, to live out their species' final generations with dignity. This is my last message, my final transmission from a world that shouldn't exist but does. I'm the last voice speaking for men who died keeping this secret, for scientists who sacrificed everything to protect these creatures, for indigenous people who've known about them for generations and kept quiet to preserve the mystery. The jungle keeps its secrets well. Let this be one of them. I've arranged for this document to be published posthumously, released to the world after I'm gone. Believe it or not as you choose. Dismiss it as fiction if that helps you sleep at night. But somewhere in your mind, in that primitive part of your brain that remembers when humanity was prey instead of predator, you'll wonder. You'll question. You'll look at the green depths of the Amazon on a map and think, what if? And that's enough. That seed of doubt, that possibility of impossible truth, that's all the protection they might need. As long as people wonder but don't know for certain, as long as the mystery remains, the creatures have their shield of uncertainty. I'm tired now, so tired. The weight of 7 decades of secrets is finally lifting from my shoulders. Whatever happens after this document is released, whatever storms of controversy or dismissal it brings, I won't be here to see it. I'll be at rest at last, reunited with my brothers from that long-ago expedition, freed from the burden of being the last witness. But in my dreams I'll still be there, still in that ancient plaza, still looking into those impossible eyes, still feeling that moment of connection between two intelligent species separated by millions of years of evolution. Still remembering the night when dinosaurs and humans stood together around a fire, ancient and modern, predator and prey, finding a moment of understanding in the green darkness. They're still out there, still surviving, still protecting their secrets. And now, finally, after 70 years of silence, I've told you their story. What you do with it is up to you. The end.